The last unit of this module is about the relationship between knowledge, mind, and brain. We have been discussing the characteristics of the human information processing system and the way various types of knowledge can be distinguished and how people actually organize their knowledge. But now we try to link that to what we already know about how the brain actually operates and which structures can be distinguished within the brain, human brain. We start with the neuron and then we, let's say, explore these memory structures and eventually a few words about clinical neurology. Okay, first the human brain and then the building blocks of the human brain, the neuron. The neuron is, as I said, the most important and smallest functional unit within the brain. Neurons are electrically excitable nerve cells, as it is stated here, and they transmit information. I think we have an example here. Yes, as you can see. A neuron has a cell body, the gray area with the dendrites on the left, with a nucleus in it, and there is at least one dendrite, or there is one, let's say, particular structure, the axon, which connects the neuron to another neuron through the axon. The axon terminals, basically. As you can see, this axon has sort of, there's a sheath of myelin, a sort of, fat sheath, which isolates the axon. We are talking about electrical impulses, and the impulse does not travel, slowly through the axon at a constant rate, but it in fact jumps from one, as it is called, node of Ranvier to another, and this jumping, over the yellowish, units here in the picture makes the rate of transmission of electrical impulses very high. And having this myelin sheath with the nodes of Ranvier makes it possible for the human information processing system to act in a very at a very high speed. Okay, let's see whether we can. Yes, we have to go back now. So to see the other information here, as I said. Well, the brain has 100 billion neurons, so a lot of neurons, so to speak, and each neuron is connected to up to 10,000 other neurons. So there are a lot of interconnections, which make the, let's say, the human memory system, information processing system, very complex. So there is a sort of, calculation of the capacity of the human brain, which is something like between 1 and 1,000 terabytes. Well, that's quite a lot, you can imagine. Cognitive development is a matter of growing, of the brain, of the human nervous system. So developing new neurons and structures, but also of pruning. So some of that means that some connections are also ended in order to make the human nervous system particular fit for the purposes it has to serve. And this both growing and pruning of the system makes it a very flexible and a very determined, so to speak, system which people use. Okay, so the neuron again is the center. We discussed that already. And then we go into the memory structures. So these are the larger structures in the human brain where all these neurons are located. First, we talk about the neocortex, which is let's say the upper part of the brain physically, the outer part of the brain if you look at you know, the human brain. And then we have the medial temporal lobe, which is part of these of the neocortex, and then we have also a look into a deeper system, the limbic system, with the hippocampus. First of all, the neocortex. Now you probably know this picture as a sort of picture of the human brain, in which the neocortex again is the outer part of the brain, which with all these kind of gyri and sulci, which is a very, you know, a very a big area because of all these windings. Now we have 4 lobes here, and all these lobes, all these sub areas, do have various different functions. The frontal lobe, which is the full part, the parietal lobe, which is something like here, the temporal lobes here, on both sides, and the occipital lobe, which is at the back, and which serves all kinds of visual information processing functions. And then the cerebellum, which is here, which is also a very important part, but which is not a part of the neocortex. I've just put some characteristics of these various lobes, some functions in the human information processing system. The frontal lobe is important for conscious thought, for decision making. The parietal lobe is for integrating information from the senses for spatial sense and navigation. The temporal lobes are for speech, vision, faces, and as seen, so the complex information processing and long-term memory, and the occipital lobe is for sight, as I already said. So these are very, 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 very gross, demarcations, so to speak, of the functions of the human brain, of the neocortex. But you have a basic idea where things happen, so to speak. And the medial temporal lobe has in it, has an important function as far as the declarative and episodic memory are concerned. So as I said, so we could also say semantic and episodic memory in our distinction. So these functions are located in the medial temporal lobe, and then in the limbic system beneath. We have 2 important organs, the hippocampus, which is very important as a center for transfer from short-term to long-term memory, as we have discussed, and also the amygdala as a memory of emotional reactions and social and sexual behavior. These are quite closely related. And so when there is some sort of, problem with the hippocampus, let's say a loss of memory, which affects basically your recent impressions. There is a problem which is called, a sort of general amnesia, which sometimes occurs and which has to do with the function of the hippocampus. Then also there are feelings of panic because the emotional functioning situated in the amygdala is also affected. So therefore these 2 symptoms, loss of memory and panic, go together. Okay, so the hippocampus is a basic transfer station, and in that sense has a lot of characteristics of what we call short-term memory, but also functions also in the transfer from short-term to long-term memory. Okay, now a few words about clinical neurology. What do we do with all kinds of knowledge about the functioning of the brain? I'm not going into the details, of the discussion whether human, let's say, identity can really be reduced to this biological substrate, as people like Dick Swaap and Victor Lama are emphasizing. That's not part of this introductory course, I think. But it is interesting to relate our knowledge of the human brain to pathology and to problems people encounter when various parts of the brain do not function. I already gave this example of this general amnesia, which sometimes occurs to people, and an author who has done a lot to describe the connection between human functioning and the brain is Oliver Sacks. With his, he has written a lot of very, very interesting studies. They all originate from, pathology, people who have problems. And one of the, better known examples is the man who mistook his wife for a hat, and other clinical tales, as it is said. And this was a situation in which a particular patient had progressive problems with his right hemisphere, and therefore was not able to, let's say, to identify complex things which he could not connect anymore. So he could not connect the stimuli which together formed the image of a particular complex system, like a glove, for instance. A thing which with 5 of these, hand-like, as we call it, forms, he could not easily identify. The man was also a painter, and interestingly, as Oliver Sacks describes, his paintings became gradually more abstract and more from the figural to more abstract and abstract, which also more or less represented the further deterioration of his right hemisphere. A very interesting story, and also other stories, of course, in numerous books Oliver Sacks has written. And it gives an idea of how, let's say, the functioning of the human brain, so the biological substrate and the human identity come together. Sacks is also explaining that he, as a neurologist, he is both a doctor and a scientist, and this combination, of let's say more distant and abstracted, observation and studying of the human brain, and the personal care and help you offer as a doctor makes his, as he explains, his job as a clinical neurologist so fascinating and so exciting. Well, this is, I think, a good example of the way our knowledge of the biological substrate and our knowledge of the functioning of the human information processing system can be combined in order to help people and to understand people in both. So now we have ended the third module on knowledge and memory. We have discussed the human information processing system. We hopefully understand now how information is being processed. We hopefully can distinguish between declarative and procedural knowledge. We can understand how people store declarative and procedural knowledge, and we can relate the processes of knowledge acquisition to the structure of the human brain.